This is not to say the members of 1995's new Republican majority lacked a political philosophy or immutable principles. Quite the contrary. These members were steeped in the Reagan tradition. But after an initial rush of laudable accomplishments, the members found themselves trapped by the contract's inherent pragmatism and particularity. Absent a philosophical anchor in the contract, members drifted into the grind of governance, which distorted Reagan's philosophical principles for public policy into non-binding precedents for political popularity. Exacerbating this process, the new majority's leaders, exuberant at having defeated an incumbent Democratic congressional majority, mistook a mandate against their predecessors as a mandate for their own finitely posited conservatism. In its first 2 years in control of the House, this led the majority's leaders to erroneously conclude it could govern as a parliament rather than as a congressional equivalent in power to the executive branch, as a Congress equivalent in power to the executive branch. And they overreached on key issues, most notably in the shutdown of the United States government over the issue of spending, artfully framed by President Clinton with sufficient plausibility as an irresponsible Republican ideological attack on good government. This moment marked the beginning of the Republican majority's end. In point of fact, from the government shutdown to the present, the House GOP conference has never had as many members as it did at that time. Some persist in too facilely dismissing this Republican debacle as being due to Clinton's superior messaging of the issue from his bully pulpit. This analysis is errant. The reason Clinton succeeded is the kernel of truth he wielded on this issue. House Republican leaders had stopped governing prudently in accordance with Reagan's political philosophy of politics being the art of the possible, and instead started acting belligerently in an ideological manner against the public's interest. It is not an accident this battle fundamentally affected Clinton's thinking and spurred his reinvention from a liberal ideologue into a pragmatic problem solver and proponent of good government. Unfortunately, Clinton's publicly applauded posturing as a centrist incensed the Republican majority and accelerated their efforts to differentiate themselves from an unprincipled president by being increasingly ideological, which they confuted with being principled. As this ideological fever progressed through 1996, too late did the new majority's members intuit the political cost to candidates considered ideologues. The Republicans' majority did survive the partisan carnage of Clinton's overwhelming 1996 re-election, but the cycle's cumulative effect was lasting and damning. Without gawking at the gruesome minutiae of each ensuing GOP ideological purge and internal coup instigated by this election, we can note it spawned the unseemly political perversion of the House Republicans' transformational majority into a transactional cashocracy, hubristically deemed by its leading denizens as a permanent majority. The GOP cashocracy was a beggar's banquet at taxpayers' expense. The cashocracy's sole goal was its own perpetuation, and its cashocrats and high priests of money theism myopically chased this aim through pragmatic corporatism and political machinations. Obviously, the cashocracy's cardinal vice was its conviction to survive for its own sake. Curiously, this was not the height of arrogance. It was the height of insecurity. Aware it stood for nothing but election, the cashocracy knew anything could topple it. This fear cancerously compelled the poll-driven cashocrats to grope for ephemeral popularity by abandoning immutable principles. Materialist to their core and devoid of empathy, the cashocrats routinely ignored the centrality to governmental policies of transcendent human beings. This cashocracy's first cardinal error facilitated its second, pragmatic corporatism. Ensconced in insular power, the cashocrats lived the lives of the rich and famous, despite their middling personal means, due to their newfound friends in the corporate and lobbying community. Cut off from Main Street, these cashocrats embraced K Street. The desire was mutual, and the corporatist influence grew gradually, but ineluctably. Closed within a corporatist echoed chamber, the cashocrats became deadened to the tribulations and aspirations of real Americans, and came to measure the success of its pragmatic policies by their reception on K Street. Reams of measures spewed forth prioritizing the interests of multinational corporations over the needs of middle-class Americans. In fairness, even without the cashocrats' incessant inducements, blandishments, and bullying, the majority of GOP members truly did feel they were promoting the interests of their constituents. This belief was insidiously sustained by the cashocrats grafting their pragmatic corporatism onto the philosophy of economic determinism. It was not an unforeseeable development. Akin to their conservative brethren who, after the fall of the Soviet Union, proclaimed the end of history, House Republicans convinced themselves the ideology of democratic capitalism was an unstoppable, deterministic force predestined to conquer the world. And, on their part, they viewed their job as hastening its triumph and preparing Americans to cope with its consequences. combined with the cashocracy's insatiable need of corporate contributions for its sustenance. This adherence to ideological democratic capitalism reveals how the Republican House majority helped President Clinton, whom they had unknowingly come to emulate and likely loathe evermore because of it, to grant the permanent normalization of trade relations to Communist China. With the enactment of this legislation, the cashocracy reached its political zenith and moral nadir, for it did not shape globalization to suit Americans' interests. It had shaped Americans' interests to suit globalization. The handsome rewards for such courageous legislation fueled the cashocracy's third vice, avarice. The process was both seductive and simple, especially in a materialistic town known for forsaking the qualitative measurement of virtue for the quantitative measurement of money. While this temptation is to be expected in a city where politicians prove their moral superiority by spending other people's money, it was equally to be expected Republicans would collectively resist it. They didn't. Earmarks, which began as a cost-saving reform to prevent federal bureaucrats from controlling and wasting taxpayers' money in contravention of express congressional intent, spiraled out of control once the cashocrats and the K Street cronies realized the process could be manipulated to direct any appropriation, however undeserving, to any client, however questionable. In turn, political contributions materialized from the recipients of these earmarks for the members on both sides of the aisle who dropped them into legislation, oftentimes without the knowledge of or the appropriate review by their peers. The passage of policy bills, too, increasingly mirrored the earmark process as special interest provisions were slipped into the dimmer recesses of bills in the dead of night. The outcome of this fiscal chicanery was an escalation of the K Street contributions to the cashocracy, required to attain its aim of perpetuating itself in power, and of the illegal perks required to sate the more venal tastes of some morally challenged members who are now paying their debts to society. Cumulatively, in addition to rendering it morally bankrupt, these three vices left the cashocracy intellectually impotent. Tellingly, within this less than subtle and manifestly sinister system of earmarks and contributions, the cashocrats greased the skids for their legislative favors by relegating the majority's younger members to voting rather than legislating, ignoring these members' qualitative virtues, ideals, and talents, measuring these members by the quantitative standard of how much money they raised, and thereby condemning these members to the status of highly paid telemarketers. Having squandered this infusion of youthful energy and insight, the cashocrats hailed the election of Republican President George W. Bush and handed him the nation's legislative agenda. At first, the cashocrats' subordination of their separate equal branch of government to the executive branch bore dividends. But by 2006, when the failures of the Iraq War's reconstruction policy and Hurricane Katrina's emergency relief torpedoed Bush's popularity, the latent danger to the cashocrats of hitching their SUVs to the fortunes of a president was evident. Precluded from tying its vicarious popularity to Bush's coattails, the cashocracy teetered beneath the gale force invective of the Democrats' campaign mantra. The congressional Republican majority was a culture of corruption, slothfully content to rubber stamp the failed policies of an unpopular president. Panic-stricken, the politically tone-deaf cashocrats urged GOP members to tout America's robust economy and attack Democrats on national security issues. This innately materialist economic argument was doomed to fail because the robust economy was not to be found in regions like the Northeast and the Midwest. The latter argument proved unconvincing to an electorate convinced Iraq and New Orleans were GOP national security fiascos. And finally, nothing could persuade an outraged electorate to return a Republican majority which, in the interest of perpetuating itself in power, failed to protect House pages from predatory members of Congress. By Election Day, the public had concluded the Republican majority cared more about corporations than Americans. And when the tsunami hit, the cashocracy crumbled down upon many now former GOP members who became the last blameless victims of its stolid cupidity. In hindsight, the cashocracy would have best heeded Theodore Roosevelt's warning, and I quote, "The things that will destroy America are prosperity at any price, peace at any price, safety first instead of duty first, the love of soft living, and the get-rich-quick theory of life."